This program is brought to you by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.
This presentation is delivered by the Stanford Center for Professional Development, providing graduate-level education to working professionals, online, on campus, and on-site. For more information, please visit study.stanford.edu.
Today we're really fortunate to have down from Seattle Monty Hamontree, and I met Monty at CHI this year at the CHI conference. We were at a talk, and I get up to go to lunch, and I turn around and I see this name badge, and I said, "Wow, I was just reading a bunch of papers by this guy." Our group was doing some work on integrating usability video and design tools, and Monty had done research in that area, almost a decade prior, and so I introduced myself, and he started talking about what he was working on now, which was Monty leads the user experience aspect of what at Microsoft is called DevDiv. So that's Visual Studio and all of their developer tools. And you don't often think about HCI and developer tools, but that's something that we're thinking about a lot right now, and that Monty's got enormous experience in. And so I'm personally really excited to hear what Monty's going to tell us today.
Hi, thanks for having me here today. I just got through having lunch with some of Scott's students, and I have to tell you that the projects that each and every one of them was working on ties in so amazingly to stuff going on. The relevance of what you're working on is just off the charts. So the thing I'm going to talk to you about today, and I would encourage you to make this interactive. I'm a self-professed big fan of Microsoft. I like it there. I am also a big self-professed addict to what I do for a living, which is design research and to participate in the design process, the ideation process in a product delivery environment. And the more you'll interact with me, the more you'll give me energy as we go through this. I'm happy to share my experiences, what's going on within Microsoft, and to just talk about the field and the domain. I'm very passionate about both. I'm going to talk to you about modeling today and what's going on within modeling, the way I think of modeling, the way the UX community at Microsoft thinks of modeling. I'll probably oscillate in and out of using the word we a lot, but changing the context of what I mean when I say we. Microsoft has a user experience community that's something on the order of 600 people that are actually in the career path at Microsoft that they identify themselves as design researchers or product designers. I run a group of about 25 user experience professionals, and so I'll talk about the local we a lot, and then occasionally I'll drift into the broader we at Microsoft within the UX community there. So modeling, what do you guys think of when you think of modeling in the design space? Do you think that's a highly systematic process to help you drive out all the requirements? So you think UML when you think of modeling in the software design space? Do you think of contextual inquiry? What do you think of? Well, we think of modeling, I think of modeling as cultivating the essence of design thinking. You can actually quote Steve Jobs at Microsoft and not get fired. Steve had a quote a few years ago that really stuck for me, and in fact, it's one of those things that occasionally will find its way onto my wall somewhere. His quote was, "The design is the soul of a man-made thing." And so for me, cultivating the essence of a design is the modeling process. So modeling is how I get at essence. And that process involves observing, distilling, and sharing what for me is the soul of the design. And so that's what we're going to talk about for the next hour plus, and then we're going to take Q&A after that. So how do we model within the larger we at Microsoft? Well, turns out pretty much if you've heard of it, we're doing it someplace, right? So these are just a few of the different modeling approaches that I know of where we have active use of them within Microsoft. How many of you ever heard of the GOMS model, right? Believe it or not, there's some places that people still are doing that kind of micro-behavioral analysis. Another place that you'll sometimes see that micro-behavioral level analysis is actually from anthropologists, where how many of you remember in kind of your freshman psych class, you know, reading about the study with kindergarten kids and, you know, beating the Bobo doll, you know, violence in the kindergarten class. A lot of the fundamental research sometimes in anthropology will go down to a very micro behavioral coding level, right? And modeling things like facial expressions, body postures, you know, things at a very, very low level of detail. And then figuring out what the patterns are in those low level detail things. Everybody in the room familiar with UML? It's a way to break down and model a software project. I think there's something like 14 different modeling perspectives within the UML framework. How many people have heard of contextual inquiry? Pretty much everybody in the room know about that. If you know about that, then you know about affinity diagramming. But a lot of people use affinity diagramming in a separate context, you know, outside of that full contextual inquiry model. Contextual inquiry did not invent affinity diagramming, by the way. There's a little modeling project within Microsoft that's called the Desirability Toolkit. And so this is mainly a sampling. It's not an exhaustive inventory. We'll touch on a few of these. How many of you have ever done a mood board exercise? Anybody ever done mood boards? Ever heard of the word charrette? Yeah, so that's a thing you can go take your search engine of preference and you can look up charrettes and find some good stuff there. It's a way of capturing the way people feel about a situation in a non-verbal way, non-textual way, using images to describe impressions, etc. Anybody ever heard of rich pictures? It's a modeling approach that focuses on basically structure and process and concerns. It's sort of a you guys, since there were so many hands around contextual inquiry, you know how it splits out things into the 5 or 6 core models and then looks at things across those different models. Well, the rich pictures is more of an integrated model, but what it does is it layers over the top of the structures in a place that you're going to design for, the processes, and then the concerns. Anybody ever done a mind map or a reality map? A few people. How about, anybody ever heard of experience walls? Anybody ever heard of E-Labs? So E-Labs back in the 90s was a really, it basically took and operationalized industrial ethnography into just a really, the people that worked at E-Labs during the 90s, you know, there's always some kind of mecca in everybody's career, you know, where that was the golden age, right? Almost everybody I've ever talked to that worked at E-Labs refers to it with that kind of golden age reference. That was when we were doing it right. That was when we were doing it cool. And they had a construct that they referred to as experience walls, where they would basically collage all of the material that they had collected from going out and interacting into the real world. And they had a series of shapes and modeling affordances that they would start to create structure over the top of those collages. So you'd end up with a lot of things that you might have in a contextual inquiry type model, like flow and communications, quotes, insights, etc. But the structure would actually take shape over the top of the artifacts that had been collected. So it was people that engaged in that process really have, like I said before, they really have a reverent kind of recollection for that whole process sequence. And we'll talk about that more in a little bit. Then we'll talk a little bit about concept models and compound models. Everybody in here, have you guys heard of Geoffrey Moore? You guys know who Geoffrey Moore was? Crossing the Chasm. Geoffrey Moore was a consultant who worked at a company called McKinsey, and then he really drove a lot of thinking around adoption and what drives adoption and how products and technologies go through an adoption life cycle. And Geoffrey is one of the most effective conceptual modelers that I've ever encountered in my career. He has a way of boiling down the essence of what's going on in a certain space, and then that essence both simplifies and enriches that space. That sounds like a paradox. You know, how can you simplify and enrich at the same time? Well, if you're a really good conceptual modeler, that's exactly what you're going for. When you find the soul of a thing, that the soul both simplifies and enriches. And then compound modeling, that's something that we've started doing more and more, where we don't just collect data, we collect models. For example, we did some work around adoption and communicating to the product groups within our division how to think about adoption, how to drive adoption, etc. And what we did was we took Geoffrey Moore's adoption model, and we took something from Gartner Group that's a model of adoption called the hype cycle. We took an adoption model that had been developed within Microsoft called the productivity bounce, and we integrated these models, and we found that when we put the models together, they both simplified and enriched each other. So now when we do modeling, a lot of the process that we're going through is we're not just collecting data in the domain we're in, we're trying to collect models that have evolved within the domain we're in, and we're looking at the models that we create and the models that have evolved and combining those models. And we're finding a lot of insight and richness from that process. So a couple of months ago, a couple of colleagues and I did a workshop at a conference for ethnographers called EPIC. And so we sent out a call for participation and ended up getting around a dozen different people to participate in a workshop on modeling. So we went in to do this workshop on how do you use modeling, what are your experiences with modeling, etc. And we wanted to have some structure to kind of have this workshop style discussion around modeling. So we started doing a model of models. And we spent a few days and we went through and we collected up our thoughts and examples of models. And this structure started to evolve over a couple of days that we were preparing for the workshop, where we found this four-quadrant structure started to evolve, where we found that some of the modeling approaches focused on this literal end, the kind of concept that the facts don't lie. How can we drive out all the facts or all the objects to think with in the space that we're in? But there were a whole set of techniques on the other end that weren't just focused on the facts. They were focused on sharing the understanding in a very expressive way. Their ultimate goal was to share. There's some researchers from Cornell that have coined a term called felt life. And the goal of their models was to bring things to life, not to share facts. Then we found this other kind of pole that started to emerge where some modeling approaches, in order to drive out all the facts, took a very segregated approach to the way they looked at the data, right? So they would take all the raw data and they would segregate it into what's all the data that we have about communication, or what's all the data that we have about workflow, or what's all the data. So UML is an example of very segregated, dividing up and looking at the domain through a set of segregated models. So we said, okay, then the other end of that segregated dimension was we found a set of modeling techniques that focused much more on the belief that the truth lies in the whole, that we want to figure out what the whole is. We want to get the essence. So do you guys do you talk about bottom-up design versus top-down design? Do you ever have those types of discussions, right? So you can think of the truth lies in the whole as trying to figure out what the essence is, and you can think of the segregated stuff as trying to think about, well, what are all the detailed objects to think with that might feed up into the whole, right? And so different modeling approaches we found tended to have an orientation of, were they trying to come top down or were they trying to come bottom up? So what we did at the workshop was we did a quick walkthrough of some modeling examples, and the different people in the workshops shared their experiences with those different modeling techniques, and people chipped in if they had used any different modeling techniques that they wanted to discuss. It wasn't in our original set. And then we basically had them plot where they saw these different modeling techniques on this 4-quadrant model that we had developed around modeling. The second thing that we had them do is we had them use the Microsoft Desirability Toolkit, which is a set of expressive words to describe feelings about a design alternative. And so they used that Desirability Toolkit to describe their experiences, their collective experiences with each of these modeling techniques. So what you're seeing here is they plotted the actual modeling approaches, and then they annotated it with the Desirability Toolkit material. So, and just in case you guys, this is what those things that were plotted on that big wall in the 4 quadrants, right? So this is the exemplar that we use for UML. We had a bunch of examples of contextual inquiry models, had affinity diagramming. We did the I am my own grandpa thing with the Desirability Toolkit. We both used it and we plotted it. This is a rich pictures exemplar that we had a few of that people used to plot. This is a mind map. This is an experience wall from the old eLabs sapient world, right? You can see the collage of the world and the structure evolving on top of the collage. You can see the arrows, the quotes, the insights, and they did some really neat things there where the shapes were very fungible and tangible that they used to create the structure over the top. And they could do encoding inside the different shapes with both color and size. If you guys are interested, we can talk more about that later. Here's the exemplar we use to talk about concept modeling, right? This is Jeffrey Moore's Crossing the Chasm, right? And this is basically, it's a concept model, right? It's using basically a distribution to help explain the concept of adoption. And then he also had this very expressive overlay on the top of it, describing what factors were going on and what part of that distribution as people move through the light bulb, the ideation phase, I get it, the bowling alley where you're starting to drive adoption in a very kind of progressive way, the tornado, at Main Street. Then we had several examples of compound modeling. This is one we'll talk about later in the presentation. This actually takes about a half a dozen different models on teaming from experts on how do you get teaming to happen. Again, we'll talk about this more in a minute. And it puts all those models into one compound model around teaming. So when the group got through plotting the models, the micro-behavioral stuff, the GOMS-like stuff, the real detailed behavior, right, that makes sense. Way down here, segregated and literal. They plotted UML down here as very literal and segregated. They actually plotted contextual inquiry as being segregated and very literal, not very expressive. They plotted the mood boards, the charrettes, and the desirability toolkit down here as being expressive, but they aren't very holistic. They take one dimension, basically the emotive dimension, and look at it. They don't look at it within the context of behavior and all. The group actually plotted affinity diagramming up there in saying that their experience with it, while affinity diagram is about, in some ways it's about kind of segmenting, it's about giving you the structures or categories. Most people had used affinity diagramming most effectively when they used it more in a holistic way. They were looking at what does this data tell us all up, right? So they were kind of emerging. They weren't pre-segregating the data, right? The structure emerged out of the holistic data. Does that make sense? Then you start going up. They plotted the rich pictures as being just barely over the edge of being expressive. The mind maps they plotted as being more expressive, a little bit more holistic. They plotted the experience walls as being very expressive and holistic. The concept models and the compound models ended up in the far upper left, kind of the holy grail of holistic and expressive. And if you remember, what was my initial thing around what's the essence of design thinking? What is the essence for me of modeling? The essence of modeling is finding the essence of your design, right? So these things play a critical role. We'll talk about how when you need to drive out the details, many times you absolutely need to be down in this quadrant. Many times you go up into that top quadrant and you find the essence, and you want to come back down into this quadrant with something like QFD. Have you guys ever heard of, there's a lady named Sheila Milano, I think, that wrote a book called Customer Focused Design. And it basically is a requirements management system that ties together requirements into scenarios and identifies all the requirements that are key dependencies for scenarios. So you may want to come from that upper quadrant back down into here. If you're working on a huge distributed team, you may need the traceability and that you get from segregating out and making all of the hidden requirements inside of the whole holistic model something that you can track. Did that make sense? So sometimes you need to take the essence and you need to work backwards down, and you need to follow that through down into all the details. And sometimes this is the right path to drive out all those details so you can track them. So we had the people in the workshop do kind of, we developed a Tagcloud out of all of the words they assigned to the different things based on the desirability toolkit. The stuff that showed up down in this quadrant is pretty consistent with what we would have expected. They used words like clean, but they also used a lot of words like impersonal, rigid, consistent, predictable, and organized, right? So it's kind of you can use it to systematically drive out the details, but they used words consistently that were kind of not very humanizing, right? And it's kind of interesting to think of things like contextual inquiry, which are user-centered design approaches, or QFD, which is another user-centered design approach that tries to be segmented and literal. And it's interesting that people describe those things with terms that aren't very humanizing, right? That they use terms like impersonal. Yeah.
So how much of this do you think is because you were talking with anthropologists who I would imagine have a greater affinity for that top right quadrant and a disdain for the lower left?
Yeah, I think it certainly needs to be looked at within the lens of who was doing it. I'm not presumptuous enough to say that, in fact, one of the studies that one of the people on our team right now is trying to get underway, they want to do the same exercise with business, basically marketing and business analysts, and they want to do the same exercise with engineers and see how the Tagcloud shifts around when you move to a different audience. Yes, I think it has to be taken within the lens of paying attention to who the audience was that generated it. Let's look at some of the terms that they were used in. As we start moving over here, you get terms like creative, impressive, inspiring. You get up into the top quadrant, you start seeing terms pop out more like approachable, engaging, innovative, stimulating. Again, it's primarily a room full of anthropologists and behavioral scientists. In that same workshop, we drove out a list of, what are your core principles or rules for effective modeling? And when we looked across everybody in that workshop, this was the set that popped out, and we're going to spend more time talking about each of these. So there's a huge predisposition, right, in this audience in terms of envisioning the whole, finding the soul of your data, as we were talking about it earlier, the soul of this design space. Within that context, there was a lot of talk about observing, foraging, distilling, and envisioning as a cross-functional team. Big emphasis on teaming. Everybody in the workshop said this doesn't work when the model is generated outside of the team that's going to handle the execution and the implementation. Big emphasis on reviewing the data and distilling the data close to capture. A big emphasis on leveraging the eyewitnesses, getting the cross-functional team out to engage with the real world. A lot of emphasis around acknowledging and contributing the insights across the entire team. So a lot of people talked about when they went out with their teams to observe that if Cindy made an observation or if Billy made an observation, they would culturally cultivate that different people on the team had IP ownership inside this evolving cluster of insights. Constantly talked about reapplying say, do, think, feel, desire, which we'll talk about more in a minute. This kind of high emotional IQ on the users, and then the AEIOU, which is an acrostic for remembering, looking at users within context, and we're going to talk about both those more in a minute. But this kind of looking from the user inside out and from outside the user back in. Big focus on inquiring into the design significance of everything, that rather than just the data that you had collected, getting your hands on every piece of data that you could get your hands on to feed into the modeling process. Big emphasis on getting physical, using space was consistently a theme across everybody in the workshop. Thinking of patterns and insights as customers' voice, sketching constantly throughout the process as they explained, and then enriching the data insights through expressive modeling. These were all trends from all these practitioners, again, at the Ethnographic Praxis Conference. There was a heavy emphasis on sketching and storytelling as the way to drive out the emergent insights, and we're going to talk about that more in a bit. So all of this material here is part of a project within Microsoft that's evolving into training curriculum for the UX community at Microsoft. So the stuff we're looking at here is kind of the early draft of that training class around orienting people to modeling within Microsoft, within the UX community. And one of the big things that we focus on orienting people to effective modeling that's very consistent with the outcomes from the workshop are the notion of that modeling, when it's at its richest and its most impactful, happens in teams, cross-functional teams. So I mentioned before, I kind of gave a teaser for this before. There's a great book, and all of these resources are at the end of the slide deck, and so when the video's posted, you can all, if you can't write fast enough to, while we're going through here, you can come back and look at the bibliography at the end. This model on teaming that we use in the training class to talk to new UX professionals about modeling, distilling the essence of a design, integrates 3 different models. There's a great book. I highly, highly recommend it, by a guy named Scott Isaacson. It's called Creative Problem Solving. And basically he switches in and out of using the term creative problem solving, and at other times he's either explicitly or implicitly talking about design. And so Scott developed, he did a big anthology of research into creative problem solving, and he found that there were 4 dimensions when cross-functional groups were working together to solve a problem that drove the dynamics and drove the success of the team. And those 4 things, he developed a whole set of variables around developing a shared situational outlook, around understanding each other's personal orientations and how those orientations fit together, around reaching a point where you could at least talk about the differences in everybody's perception on what was the core task that they were working on, and then ferreting out what was really the desired outcome. So it's amazing how many times that you can give people a list of saying, well, what are our desired outcomes? And everybody, so the things he has in his taxonomy there are things like novelty, concreteness, marketability, user satisfaction, etc. And you can have a team full of people that you would think, well, everybody, obviously, we all know that we're going for novelty number 1 and this number 2, and you'll find out that there's people sit there and go, no, concreteness, right? Concreteness, that's the biggest thing that we're going for here because we're date-driven or blah, 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 blah. So in the more full-blown set of training materials, it walks through all of these dimensions that if you're trying to help a team drive out the essence of an opportunity, or the essence of what the design soul is for the thing you're building, you need to look and have the framework to talk about these 4 dimensions and how they interact. This inner model is by a guy named Tuckman. Have you guys all heard the old forming, storming, norming, performing trajectory? So there's a bunch of many, many different variations of that progression, talking about how teams move through this process of becoming highly performing teams, highly functional teams, where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And it turns out as they're moving through this tiering model, 2 things are changing. The way they work together is shifting from an orientation to an organization to open data flow to true integrated problem solving. But in order to make that task progression, the team is also going through this personal relationship dynamic within the team, from dependency to tension to cohesion to interdependency. So it's kind of one of those chicken and egg things, right? Does the task change first and that shapes the relationships, or do the relationships start shifting and then they enable the group to start performing together as a body and interact together differently? So there's this Tuckman model in the middle, and then over the top of that we took I think 5 different models on what makes hot teams. One of them was David Kelly's list from what's the Art of Innovation? Was that his book that had the list of hot team qualifiers? There's a Swedish psychologist named Ekvall that did a bunch of research around innovative teams versus stagnant teams. So we started plotting out what were these hot team characteristics, and there was using different words, there was a lot of synergy. When people were moving through this forming process, it was critical to have the right mix of people. Have you guys ever heard of a guy named Bill Buxton? Another great book. Bill Buxton's book on sketching user interface is just an amazing book. Bill has a great quote that he uses regularly in his talks. He says, "When I start a new team, the last thing I want is another me, because I already have one," right? So it's not about heterogeneity to remove the friction, but it's a homogeneity to remove the friction. It's about getting heterogeneity that functions. And I know that's very much a part of the way your whole department came into being and the way you guys look at the world. But we plotted a bunch of those hot words that came out. There was consistently conversation about building a museum and using physical space and physical memory to collect the objects to think with. There was every framework that we looked at had something about abolishing the concept of they. So anyway, when we start talking to teams about how to distill the essence of a product, one of the big things that we talk to them about is they have to figure out how to get this cross-functional teaming to work. One of the controversial statements that I use when I'm giving this deck within Microsoft is I say, I don't care if your design IQ is 3 times as high as mine. If you give me 5 average people to work with, I will kick your butt every time in terms of coming up with a richer list of ideas and a more integrated outlook on those ideas. And if you give me a cross-functional team, I don't care how smart you are, the cross-functional team will outperform the lone genius in a complex space. So that's kind of the premise within which we look at the distillation process. It's not about figuring out how you can go figure it out. It's about how you get everybody to go figure it out together. Yes? Hi.
A couple of the things you talked about there seem to have the requirement of shared proximity, whether it's to share a museum or to be next to someone or just establishing that trust. Can you talk about some of the challenges you've seen for project teams that are in different physical environments and how you overcome those?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Sure. So I don't know if that got picked up by the mic or not, so I'll repeat it real quickly. The question was, a lot of the factors on here seem to point to you need a shared space, you need to all be in the same location in order to do the distillation, the soul finding process, right? And I basically think you do have to all be in the same place to find the soul. I think that once you go to technology-mediated ways of trying to do that, the flow. Another set of factors that we looked at was all of Csikszentmihalyi's stuff on flow, and he has some really interesting stuff on group flow that's less well known than his stuff on individual flow. And I think group flow during this soul-finding process is so critical that I don't really think you can do it in a distributed way. So our tactic is, during this early soul-finding way, if the project involves multiple locations like Microsoft India and Microsoft Redmond, then we generally recommend doing something akin to the IDEO deep dive process, right, where we find a place in the middle, or we go to one place or the other, and we go through this distillation process and envisioning process where we have close proximity, and then we divide back up because the work is often executed in different places. But in some ways that makes it even more critical to come together, because basically the presupposition is you need the people to proselytize the essence, to be involved in the essence process. So you need people from all the places. You need to thoughtfully think about bringing in people from the places that the work's going to be executed in to participate in that essence finding, because there's always going to be a richness to the essence that isn't completely communicated through the artifacts. And in fact, a big part of the essence finding process that we're going to talk about is the storytelling and sketching. And when you're exploring and unlocking the ahas through that, you need storytellers that can go back out and tell the stories that evolved around the essence. So I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit, but why the big emphasis on teaming when we're going through finding the essence? Well, the presuppositions that we have are that you're going to end up with an outcome or a notion of the essence through teaming that's more insightful through the diversity of ideas, that's more cohesive due to the synergy you now have through the different perspectives. It's more robust due to the checked assumptions. It's more cost effective due to the reduced churn. This is a big thing in a large distributed team, that if people don't really get the essence, then you find that you spend a huge amount of time churning over the fact that people don't really either get the mission, believe in the mission, or that they think the mission is incomplete and therefore they need to extend it. This kind of cohesiveness of vision, I've never worked at Apple, so I can't say what actually goes on within the four walls, but I can certainly say that one of the external reputations of Apple is that it does follow this concept of having the cohesive vision, and how any churn that deviates from that vision is looked at culturally as very bad. So teaming is at the bedrock of our essence finding process, or our essence finding outlook. The other thing that's at the heart of it is this thing that we refer to as observing holistically. And this is a compound model that we use to talk about that and communicate around this internally. So this inside circle, the little talking ziggy head thing, the think, feel, desire, say, and do. There's some fair amount of recent discussion and research in business around emotional IQ. Have you guys seen anything about the emotional IQ stuff? So think of the stuff in the middle as trying to develop a really rich emotional IQ. And we actually tell our researchers, many of whom that have come right out of academia, we want you to embrace your intuition. And they say what? I thought what you wanted me to do was to make sure that the research is repeatable by anybody else can do it. It doesn't, I'm not involved, right? I'm the dispassionate observer. That's what I'm supposed to do, right? And one of the biggest tendencies that we have to break especially with behavioral scientist students, or psychology, anthropologists, etc., coming in, is to retrain them that we want them to use their intuition as a key part of their research methodology and as a key part of their analysis and sharing process. And so we talk a lot about how really the heart and soul of user experience as a career path within Microsoft is two things that are very consistent with Bill Mogridge's book and David Kelly's philosophy, right? We use different terms, but one is basically the people-centered term, the people-centered concept, to learn by really climbing inside the person's head and really learn by developing a rich, deep emotional IQ. And then also looking at what, so what we talk about is we bring people into our usability lab. We don't run a usability study. It's a bad thing. You're going to get major demerits if you ever run a research project and your product team doesn't show up. The question is, what did you do wrong, right? If you're in the lab and your cross-functional team didn't come to see the study, you messed up someplace. Something's not right. So, and when we bring people into the lab from the team or when we take them out to the field, we really start getting them to pay attention to emotional IQ. So we talk about when the person's behavior, what they were doing, didn't match up with what they said, right? That's something that we really call out. So if you had ever worked in a problem, if you guys were all industry folks, if you were working on product teams at Microsoft, and I said, how many of you had ever gone in and talked to somebody who watched somebody work with your product, and it was like making somebody walk on broken glass, that everything was cringe, pain, agony, despair, self-defeatism, and then at the end you said, what'd you think? And they said, it was fine. Everybody in the room will go, oh yeah, that happens all the time, that happens all the time. So the observational heart to UX is one of the things that there aren't really any other disciplines or roles at Microsoft that really focus on learning by observing. And when we get people to see that there's the ability to triangulate when you learn by observing, you can match what they say to what they do, you can project what people are thinking and feeling based on the disparity and the congruity between those different channels you have. We talk a lot about, have any of you guys ever heard of the Kano model or the Kano model? So the Kano model is a thing, I think it was a Japanese researcher developed a taxonomy for looking at different product ideas that you were thinking about moving forward with and having users give you feedback. And the holy grail for a product idea that you're looking at is what in their taxonomy is called an exciter. So an exciter is a thing that the user doesn't currently know they want, but as soon as they see it, they feel like they've wanted it their whole life, right? So an exciter in your product is going to be something that meets a latent user need, and it meets it immediately to the point that it feels like something that they've wanted forever, and that they've, well, on a latent need, can I through say a survey, can I send you out and ask you, tell me about the things that you really want but you don't yet know that you want, right? So this is, when you talk about the role of observational research in design, that's one way you can talk to people and say, okay, marketing plays a role, broad market research, surveys, etc. play a role. They help us characterize the market, but they're not going to help us with activities like uncovering latent user needs. And so we're able to talk about the role of observation in the creative process. One of the things that we talk about is it being the engine for these latent user needs. We talk about this emotional IQ and getting inside the user wrapped within this context of situated cognition, right? So we all know that the way somebody's feeling is heavily influenced by what's going on around them, right? There's very few people that are totally just intrinsic locus of control, right, where everything around them doesn't matter. So we use an acrostic to talk about what's going on around the user, and we use AEIOU. So A is basically the activities or behavior, task flows, larger level processes, etc. involved. We talk about the environmental factors. We talk about the interpersonal interactions, which are the social factors. We talk about the objects or things that the user's interacting with. And we also talk about user traits. So user traits, think of this stuff in the middle is what's going on with the user in the moment. The user traits for us are things that are persistent across time and across situation. So we discuss those within the context of environmental factors. So why the big emphasis on observing holistically? We talked about the latent needs. It also ends up that over and over and over again, we find that one of the single most invigorating events in a cross-functional team's life cycle is engaging with real users. If you can set it up and make that fit within the thing you have to do is you have to time it within the rhythm of the product life cycle, right? You can't ask them to do something at the wrong time that breaks the rhythm, but if you time it within the rhythm of the life cycle, these shared experiences with customers invigorate the whole process. So the next thing that we talk a lot about when we're going through this finding the essence process is what we refer to as brokering proudly. There's a researcher at Xerox PARC named Stu Card that has this thing called the sense-making loop. This is a little extract from part of Stu's sense-making loop that focuses on the foraging part. So it turns out that when you look at innovative cultures or innovative environments, you might think that the innovative environments would be more isolationist, give us time to think and we'll innovate. There was an ethnographic firm that came in and did a research study at IDEO, I think in the late 90s. And they found that when they characterized the overall process at IDEO, they found that there were many similarities between IDEO at the time and Edison Labs. So there's a bunch of books about Edison Labs and how prolific Edison Labs was as an innovation incubation engine, number of patents, all that stuff. And the firm that did the study at IDEO found there were the following parallels between IDEO and Edison Labs. They found that there was a heavy cultural appetite for accessing and cultivating exposure to new domains and new design objects to think with. So Edison Labs would intentionally go out and cultivate contracts in new industries to pull back the design objects from those industries to think with. There's all the classic stories from IDEO about taking apart toys and using the motors inside of toys to design the first docking station for the Apple, early Apple laptop, etc. So this notion of cultivating exposure to data, to design elements, to user understanding. An acquisition or clearinghouse philosophy around that, stockpiling solution parts prominently, fostering subject matter experts, valuing the reputation of people who were foragers and who had collected domain understanding in a certain stripe or segment. And then finally, there were a lot of processes around a retrieval for those abstract points of value and a culture of adopting proudly stuff that had been foraged for, right? That, kind of sort of the Uber badge of honor was if you had gone out and found stuff that you could put together in new novel ways so that the whole was greater than the parts, was one of the most revered forms of creativity, right? The ability to broker together ideas. And when you talk to many people in the field of design, like a Bill Buxton or like a Bill Mogridge, that have worked in quite a wide variety of design environments, they'll tell you they can tell that they're in a hot environment or not by how many objects to think with litter the environment, right? How much foam core is there up on the wall with design artifacts on it? How many design artifacts are there on the tabletops, on the surfaces? So in the brokering space, consistently we see design cultures or design environments that are focused on cultivating essence. They're seeking out all useful sources of information, and they're figuring out ways to keep those objects to think with hanging around. The heavy emphasis on timely foraging and sharing, uniquely branding as many experts as they can, right? The notion of getting people to be the sponges or the collectors of the information, so that one of your retrieval strategies is to have these human sponges that you can come in and squeeze and hook together. Heavy emphasis on the more vivid the evidence, the higher the impact. So design cultures tend to go more toward the experience wall into the continuum, right? That there's collages of more vivid material. To engineering-dominated cultures tend to be more down on the, just give me the flow chart. I don't need the, I don't need all the, yeah.
Lessons learned often includes failures, but it's hard to get around people's egos in that.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. One of the key things you see inside of a design-centric culture is, in fact, I can't remember the industrial designer. If you're interested in this and you send me a note, I'll track down the name for you. One of the leading industrial designers in the Industrial Revolution that hit in the 20s, 30s, 40s, one of the things that he did was he went around at the end of the day every day and checked everybody's wastebasket. And if their wastebasket wasn't full, you got called in on the carpet the next morning, right? So one of the common things you see in a design culture is reveling in the amount of crap that you throw away, right? But at the same time, you never really throw anything away. So it's kind of a weird, but the notion that you are going to learn by trying, that was the second thing that I was coming back to. We talked about learning from people. The other thing that you consistently see in a design culture is learn by trying. I think in Bill's book he calls it learn by prototyping. That you learn by making stuff, right? And when you're learning by making stuff in a design culture, that's what's going on, because there's a great diagram in Bill Buxton's book around design sketching, where he talks about he shows in a design culture the thing you want to look at, and you want to see a bunch of leaves on the exploration tree that went off and died, and that the design culture, you've got a lot of dead branches is the way you're healthy and cooking. And in an engineering culture, each dead branch is viewed as waste, and is viewed as, well, why didn't we figure out how to converge in a way that we minimized waste? So yes, that's a very good point.
Organizations, it has its failures, like, for example, Clippy, the paper clip comes to mind.
Yeah.
How do you think about that?
Yeah. Well, we definitely have some world-class belly flops that we've made, and there's no simple answer to that. I mean, culturally, Microsoft still has a long way to go in terms of appreciating failures, but one of the things that it's doing much more aggressively now is to do envisioning early in the process, to come up with multiple concepts and to share those concepts, and to kind of embrace this discovery, learn by trying process within the product life cycle. I think we still have ways to go in terms of really appreciating the failures that went all the way through to shipping, and that we need a healthy proportion of those and that type of thing. But we are getting the learn by trying better in the front end of our process. So the last thing that is tongue-in-cheek here is, you guys know the whole Tom Sawyer story, right, about painting the fence, and how he basically sold everybody on such how enjoyable painting the fence was that all of his buddies ended up painting the fence for him, right? Our philosophy within the UX community around this brokering process and distilling process, if we really want it to catch hold, we have to be out painting Tom's fence and going, oh, you know, you can hook this to this, and if we take this in from here, and so we really try to get this brokering culture thing going. Now, what's hard, there's a balance here, right? Because what you want to do is you want to design for each situation that you find and you want to optimize for the context you're designing for. So one of the things that we have to counter against is you don't want to end up with Frankenstein products, where what you've done, the example I sometimes use is, you know, that show America's Top Model or whatever it's called, right? You're not going to end up with the most beautiful face if you have everybody go pick the most attractive nose, you go pick the most attractive lips, you go pick the most attractive ears, you pick the most attractive chin, forehead, etc., and you put those things together and you go, ugh, right? So the whole brokering thing is a part of this synthesis process of finding the essence in the whole. It's not just a gluing stuff together. So why the big deal on brokering? In a design culture, you're working with objects to think with. You covet objects to think with. You want to do some bottom-up modeling to get objects to think with. You want to do top-down modeling to get objects to think with. Flattening those out and keeping them and using space to remember gives you these hydration points to rehydrate the inspiration you have from the users, to rehydrate the design elements that you want to leverage and build off of. It helps you reveal the gaps in spaces where you don't have anything to build upon. The distilling collectively, we talked a little bit about already. This kind of notion of how we have the emerging essence of the design. We typically do that through trying to get as many of the raw objects to think with as we can in space. We try to annotate those. We build models on top of the annotations. Then we annotate the models. And then we talked about compound modeling. Then we look to build models out of the models. All trying to roll up and capture this essence of the design that we're trying to deliver. And two processes that we push that are bedrock processes that you typically don't see through any other disciplines other than UX are sketching and storytelling. And again, we do the paint Tom's fence thing. Every time that we're going to spur up a creative conversation, we try to take people out to the wall and we try to tell the story over the top of the wall. And then we try to sketch as the different insights are coming out. So if you look at the creative problem-solving literature, you look at the story of some of the most prolific innovators. Many of them had a strategy for what, lack of a better term, was to put themselves in a state of what they refer to as relaxed attention, or what can be referred to as relaxed attention. They had their favorite chair that they would go sit in. They had Thomas Edison, I think, is somebody who was famous. He would go out and walk something like 6 times around their work complex every evening at the same time of day. and he would credit that laps around the building as being the most prolific time in his day in terms of design and innovation, etc. So there's a lot of evidence that says there's latent ahas wrapped inside your data, wrapped inside your collective shared experiences as a group. And the way you get those latent ahas to come out is you tell stories together and you sketch together. So you tell the story of the trip you had to MySpace, or you tell stories of the user who was in the lab and who, cried, right? So it turns out that storytelling, anytime you tell a story, guess what? The story changes every time you tell it, because storytelling involves a receiver and a sender, and the reactions on the part of the receiver change the way the sender delivers the story. And when I first started working at Microsoft about 6 years ago, all the people in my team thought either I was really slow or that I thought that they were really slow, one of the two. Because I kept telling them the same stories over and over again about what I thought was the essence of the situation, or what was the essence of our design concepts, right? And they would sit there and go, we talked about this yesterday afternoon, right? And it took them a while to get in that notion that that storytelling exercise is a part of the process for unlocking the ahas. That each time you tell the story, you subtly steer it based on what the sender is sending you, but it actually helps you to steer it to something that you already knew, but you just hadn't been able to surface before. So the big deal on distilling, this is the heart of finding the soul. It simplifies and enriches at the same time. It fosters insights. It makes the essence tangible and shareable when you do a good job. Shorthand language that the team works off of. Big picture understanding. The final element is it's the old, if the tree falls in the forest and there's nobody there to hear it, does it make a sound? If you have essence and you can't transmit that to another person, it has very little value. So the ability to envision what the essence is that you've distilled, and to spend a lot of energy and a lot of time in these data visualizations of the essence is key. And when we're going through this envisioning process of how to make the essence concrete, we find ourselves flipping back and forth from talking about what is this similar to, right? This is looking at other models of models and stuff. What's it analogous to? What's it like? We find ourselves switching from trying to look at it top down, looking at it bottom up. We're changing our perspective to try to find that way to encapsulate and envision the essence so that we can share it. And for us, the holy grail of modeling is in that expressive realm, that it brings the people, places, and things that are currently exist, or the people, places, and things in the environment that we're trying to create in the future to life. So internally, this is a little mnemonic that we use to help people in the UX community try to hang on to this framework. We use the little iris, the little camera eye, to help people hang on to that: teaming insightfully, observing holistically, brokering proudly, distilling collectively, and envisioning vividly. And then we've represented each of those concept areas as a little iconic element around, right? You've got to get the team to radiate out through that storming, norming, performing cycle. You've got to look outside the user in and inside the user out. You want to collect everything that you can get your hands on and broker the ideas. You want to distill, do the emergent data analysis through sketching and storytelling. And you want to change your perspective and envisioning to take as much leverage of analogy and reference. And like what did Jeffrey Moore basically say that adoption was analogous to, right? Adoption is analogous to moving through a distribution. And then how do you make that expressive, the way people move through a distribution? Well, for anybody that knows the model, it tends to stick with you. For people who read Jeffrey Moore 10 years ago can take that same diagram and tell you an amazing amount of depth in the story about Jeffrey Moore's adoption model. So again, we looked at all of these techniques. They're all actively used at Microsoft now, all critical. The key is to understand what's the strengths and weaknesses, what context to switch in and out of the different quadrants. The references are all in the back to many of the different modeling techniques that we looked at, and to many of the more broad books and resources that kind of shape, that are good at characterizing different pieces of the process or have shaped my thinking throughout my career. I think we've got a few minutes for questions. Yes.
Hi, I'm curious as to how adoption occurs amongst, I think, a culture of mainly engineers when you come up and show these sort of ways of functioning and that are pretty more touchy-feely than the usual UML diagrams.
Yeah.
So how does that work out for you and your team?
So we kind of cheat a little bit. So what we do is we try to steer the people that get brought into that early planning process where we can, and say, okay, we need this cross-functional group to go off and do the envisioning. And where possible, we have developed relationships with stakeholders in the different businesses that we know have affinity for doing, some of the combined divergent and convergent thinking and using a lot of the teaming approach. So sometimes we try to steer the selection in a given direction. Sometimes we go commando, and what we do is go build our own side alliances to try to get critical mass rolling. And it turns out that in a corporate situation, the person who can get to a tangible vision the fastest often wins. Good, bad, or indifferent. The quicker you can disambiguate, and it turns out that long written descriptions, 30-page documents are not a particularly effective way to disambiguate. So we've kind of gotten to a point now that we're a competitive weapon, where the people are learning they can disambiguate way faster if they get the design researchers and the envisioning resources together. So it becomes and the overall corporate soup of trying to get projects resourced, the soup has started to go, oh, wait a minute. Everybody who has a click-through or a walk-through always tends, over the course of the last couple of years, they end up faring better than the people who don't have that. So what happens is everybody goes, oh, to compete, I have to participate in this distillation, this essence finding, and the envisioning process, right? So your ability to get your stuff funded is heavily gated based on your ability to communicate. And so we've kind of gotten this it's caught momentum as a competitive weapon. You can't compete as effectively in the overall resource scrum if you don't have it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I agree with you that teams in general win over the Lone Ranger individuals. But sometimes you just get a dysfunctional team that's not gelling, and everybody on there is just dreading every day of it, waiting for the damn thing to die.
Yep.
What do you do then?
Yeah, so I agree with you. There are also the case, though, to be fair, there are lone geniuses who are just amazing, right? So there are lone geniuses who at Microsoft are incredibly successful. And when you find those people, the last thing you want to do is to screw it up, right? So, but in general, the teams scale better than lone geniuses, and there are things you can do to nurture a team. It's much harder to nurture a lone genius. So whenever you have a dysfunctional team, I don't have a good answer for you other than, you know, sometimes you just have to either literally or conceptually, you have to isolate the cancerous parts and cut them out, right? You don't want to do that. You want to find a way to find their... part of that whole teaming slide was about tapping into what their value system is and tapping in, you know, a notion of the way the parts fit together such that they see that their value system is going to come back to the forefront of the team dynamic later. A lot of the dysfunctional teams have to do with people overcompensating for each other rather than... so what we see regularly is that you guys have I think it was in Bill Mogridge's book. I know it's in Bill Buxton's book, the whole divergent convergent cycle. There's some really great research on creative problem solving around that divergent convergent cycle that talks about four kind of root orientations that people have in the design equation. Talks about generators, conceptualizers, optimizers, and implementers, right? And it talks about the different value systems in each of those four. And what often happens if they don't see the bigger ebb and flow of how all those roles fit together, they start trying to compensate for each other. And once that starts happening, what the optimizers and the implementers try to do is they think that the generators and conceptualizers are going to go open loop. So they start trying to shut them down and make them converge. The conceptualizers and generators, as soon as they see that, they see premature convergence, and they start trying to resist all forms of a push to converge. And then you get into this where everybody isn't really trying to meet in the middle. They think everybody is all off base, and they start just, the whole thing degenerates. So one thing that we found helpful is to basically talk about how the optimization thing is absolutely just as important as the generation phase. And that's going to play a dominant role when we move into this cycle. And so through education of the fact that we are going to converge, we aren't going to go open loop, just education we find sometimes helps with some of that. Yeah.
Another thing you work big on is leadership. You're mentioning leadership and the role leadership plays in this. Like, for example, Apple.
Yep.
Leadership is really big.
Yeah. Yep. So I think there's some of the Apple stuff from what I've heard from people that work there is a little bit urban legend on the whole leadership thing. You guys are deeply wired into the whole IDEO culture, etc. And one of the things that they talk about it in the Art of Innovation and in the Nightline videotape, etc. from IDEO, you do need to find adults, right? You do need to find people to come in, and I can't remember what they call them at IDEO, but basically there's facilitators that understand the ebb and flow that needs to happen between all those roles that we just talked about, and they provide some overall level of management and oversight to say, okay, I know that you generators and conceptualizers, would really like to keep going, but we're going to kind of shift gears and we're going to kind of move our center of gravity. We're not going to shut that down altogether, but we're going to move our center of gravity into here. So you do need facilitation experts to help the team move through the process. And what we're those facilitation experts right now come from many different roles at Microsoft, but it's key that you identify who's the person that's going to be the person that marshals the whole thing through. Yeah. Any more questions? Yeah.
Just one question about how you think some of this applies in non-product focused settings like industrial research labs and even to academia, right? So both in the team construction and the value of creating different artifacts along the way, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So it's kind of a if you go look at Parsons School for Design or the Chicago Institute of Design or the Stanford D School website or Carnegie Mellon, many of the leading design schools, it almost looks like they hired the same person to do the website for all of them. I think design institutions have really embraced the notion of cross-functional collaboration. Almost, which came first? I don't know. Did industry start cluing on first, or did the academic institution start cluing in first? But every leading design program right now has a heavy bent that I know of, has a heavy bent toward this cross-functional teaming. And they're actually cultivating that teaming through the way they do cross-departmental collaboration, the way they're recruiting students, I'm seeing in a lot of the outside world looking back into academia that there's a lot of emphasis on this cross-functional teaming within most of the institutions, that we're in a kind of a project-centric approach to the way that people go through the curriculum. And so I don't know if the academic institutions are doing that because they think it equips students better for industry, or if both have kind of feel that the cross-functionality helps with the ideation and the delivery of content. So I don't know if it's a preparatory move to enable people for industry, or if both are mirroring the same pattern for independent reasons. But I'm seeing the same pattern in academia that I'm seeing in industry. I don't know, do you guys feel like you have a heavy emphasis on teaming? Back 15 or 20 years ago, my perception was there was far less emphasis on teaming within most of the design schools than there is today. But I don't know, do you feel that's true too? Yeah. Sort of, maybe not quite. Do you want to narrow it down?
Oh, no, that's a good answer for now. I can ask more questions offline.
Sure.
Has it been sort of a missionary work there at Microsoft to get this into the culture? Or does it just slide right in seamless?
Oh, no. I was telling Scott earlier today, you can kind of feel the culture within any place that you're working when it starts shifting based. One of the indicators, one of the canaries in the coal mine, is the people who are the people that are running up through the organization, the people who are quote unquote the fast track people. You can feel the culture start shifting when the fast track people are taking a consistent slant on building their career capital. And so what we're seeing within Microsoft is that design, that envisioning, that telling the story, finding the soul thing is definitely becoming a key business imperative. It's also becoming a way that you can see these fast track people are going, wait a minute, this is the way I compete in the overall organizational soup, is through experience design and through cultivating my building that into my team and that kind of thing. So a lot of it is happening due to the spirit of the times that's going on within Microsoft. It's not that UX has come in as this little Trojan horse thing and has caused the whole aircraft carrier to start changing its stripes. It's a much broader cultural thing that's happening. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you guys. Thanks for having me.
For information on other online Stanford seminars and courses, please visit study.stanford.edu.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.